artifact tells a story. Our story highlights some very personal choices made by victims of horror, survivors of spirit, and role models of spiritual leadership. Rav Yaakov Avigdor was the revered chief rabbi of Drobich, Poland, and its surrounding villages. In addition to being a respected Jewish spiritual leader, Rav Yaakov was also a chaplain for the Jewish soldiers in the Polish military. Rav Yaakov's son, Reb Yitzchak Avigdor, served as his father's assistant. He learned from his father how to listen, to learn, and to lead.
Juden, raus, schnell!
Often the first targets of Nazi persecution were the leaders of the Jewish communities to whom the people looked for guidance and advice.
June 30th, 1941. The Germans have Father at the very top of the list of those to be promptly liquidated. Every week or two we transfer him from one house to another. He has shaved off his beard and payas, and it's difficult to recognize him. I am Father's contact with the outside world. I bring food, news, and messages from various people, requests for advice, questions of Jewish law.
In times of great challenge and personal suffering, some people make the choice to ask, others the decision to answer. And ultimately, individuals must resolve whether they can and will abide by those decisions. The paskening of shilos and shuvos, questions and answers, and proper interpretation of halacha. Spiritual leaders of the time faced unimaginable questions, and the challenge to comprehend the incomprehensible. Jews wanted to do Hashem's will even under those circumstances, especially under those circumstances.
I have obtained false papers identifying me as a Christian. Can I go to church so that people will really believe I'm not Jewish?
30 of us have built a bunker, but it can only fit 25. Which 5 people should be left out to die?
Within months of the German invasion, the Jews were ghettoized, and that is, they were put into confined quarters and separated from the rest of the population. The Germans engaged in a fascinating way of governing the ghetto. In a memo in September 1939, right after the invasion, Reinhold Heydrich essentially said that the Jews had to appoint a leadership consisting of 24 men, leaders of the Jewish community, who were to be made personally responsible for carrying out German orders. The Judenrat was put in an impossible situation. To the Germans, they made representation of Jewish needs. The Germans were not interested in Jewish needs. And to the Jews, they represented German decrees, and German decrees were going to be lethal. There were a variety of Judenrats, and we now know the research has been vast, and some behaved with absolute integrity, some had corruption. For some, power went to their heads. Other Judenrat leaders led their community.
You had members who were sincerely trying to help their fellow Jews, which were with them in the ghetto. On the other hand, you had members who thought they could save themselves by working with the Nazis, by collaborating with the Nazis. So you had certain Judenrat leaders who were hated by the fellow Jews, and then you had those who were revered. Reb Yitzchak Avigdor was part of the Judenrat. He served as a member of the Chevra Kadisha. Jews were dying in the ghetto from hunger, disease, or just the Nazis killing them. And being that the Beis HaChaim, the cemetery, was located outside of the ghetto, it gave Rabbi Yitzchak a certain amount of freedom of movement to leave the confines of the ghetto, thus enabling him to build a bunker outside, where eventually he and his family hid.
In April of 1944, the hideout was discovered, and the Avigdors were taken to Plaszow. On the train, Rav Yaakov used the time to teach his son well.
Yitzchak, look through the cracks. Do you see the moon?
Yes, Father, I do.
By studying the moon, you will always know when a new month begins. You must practice with me now, my son, while we still have time. You must memorize the Jewish calendar for the next 2 years.
But why only 2 years?
Mark my words, within these 2 years, my son, either Hitler will be gone or the Avigdors will be gone.
Rabbi Avigdor is universally revered for what he did in those circumstances. He was desperately afraid that Jews would not know when there was Shabbat and when there was Yontif, when there was Rosh Chodesh, when there were any of the Shloshet Regalim, when there were the Yomim Noreim. So what he did was to compile a universal Jewish calendar. And this was an act of spiritual resistance of the highest magnitude, because he was not convinced that he would live, but he was deeply convinced that with this calendar, Jewish life would continue to be Jewish life.
Each time his calendar got lost or was destroyed, he composed another one from memory. His final calendar was written in the Buchenwald concentration camp shortly before liberation. So even when it was almost impossible to keep the Yom Tovim, fulfill those mitzvahs, at the very least, a person could try, or at least remember that it was Yom Tov.
July 1944. Rav Yaakov and Reb Yitzchak Avigdor, after having been through so much together, were now separated, deported to different concentration camps, unsure of their fate and of whether they would ever see each other again.
In the death camp, the main purpose of the death camp was to essentially, on assembly line process, to bring the Jews to death. In 1942, between Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, 265,000 Jews were transported to Treblinka, and at the end of that period, none of them, not one, were alive. In Treblinka, no Jews survived. The destruction rate was 99.99%. 900,000 Jews were deported to Treblinka, maybe 100 survived. In Belzec, 500,000 Jews were killed in 10 months. There are only 2 known survivors. In Sobor, 250,000 Jews were killed, and there were less than 100 survivors. So the death camp was lethal. Conditions there were not designed to allow the Jew to live. Conditions there were designed to make sure that the Jew died.
Mauthausen, March 1945. A Jew from Lodz smuggled a tiny tefillin shel Rosh into our barracks. Early every morning while lying in my bunk, I secretly put on the tefillin. For this great zechus, I give this Jew, whenever I can, a piece of my bread or a few spoonfuls of soup. May 5th, 1945. Today is a good day. Restful. Today the SS haven't chased us out of the barracks. Why? No one knows. It doesn't matter. At least it's peaceful. Don't need to get up. No standing for roll call, no food, just peace. It is so close. Death is approaching. We hear shooting. It's getting closer and louder. Outside there is turmoil. People are running and screaming. There is wild shooting. Bullets are flying in the air. What is this? No one knows. Suddenly a tank emerges from the woods. On the tank there's a white star. Is this a dream or reality? Americans, liberation. We have yet to grasp it. Someone asks me, "What are you doing? Are you crying?" "I'm not crying," I reply. "It's crying on its own. I'm not even moving." Yes, after 6 horrific years of ghetto, bunker, fear, torture, concentration camps, and more concentration camps, for the first time, I am crying.
We have an image of liberation which is of a great triumph. For the Jews, liberation was bitter-sweet. Sweet because seemingly there was no longer an enemy. Bitter because in the camps you had to steel yourself. You had to be able to not allow yourself to fully feel. And for the Jews, essentially, liberation was the first moment they were permitted to feel without risking their lives. And what did they feel? They felt total emptiness, they felt total loss. They had to confront the question of, where's my family? And they had no community to go back to. Their community had been destroyed. There was nothing to return to. Survivors put it this way. One woman said, for 12 years we feared death, and we woke up one morning and understood that we also feared life.
After the war, the survivors continued to suffer. In Bergen-Belsen alone, some 13,000 people died after liberation from disease and various afflictions which they were suffering from. Yet despite everything, the survivors were determined to rebuild physically, and many of them were determined to rebuild spiritually.
Rav Yaakov had also survived and was liberated from the Buchenwald concentration camp. 2 weeks later, on Pesach Sheni, Rav Yaakov received a package with matzos. With tears in his eyes, he not only recited the blessing for the matzos, but he also proclaimed the bracha of Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higianu lazman hazeh. Still, Rav Yaakov's joy was tempered with the overwhelming sadness of the loss of his family.
One of the big spiritual challenges confronting rebirth was the issue of agunas. Women seeking to remarry had to determine what happened to their husbands. Had they been killed? Were they dead? Only once that had been confirmed could they halachically remarry.
Belzhitz had 500,000 victims, only 2 survivors. How do you know that your husband is not one of those 2 survivors? And therefore the rabbis had to devise ways and work creatively and imaginatively, and also with faithfulness to the halakha, to find ways to enable people to rebuild their lives. The issue was less critical with men, but it was absolutely critical with women. And you also had the problems not only of agunas, but also of yavamas, because some of these husbands died childless. And the question then became, not only did the husband die, but what about his brothers? And how do you get chalitza? And how do you free a woman in order to remarry? This was a decision that perplexed the rabbis, that shattered the rabbis, that frightened the rabbis. And it was a decision that demanded courage and creativity, discipline, and a sense of mesirat nefesh in order to do what was right, what was required, and in order to go through the Herculean steps to allow people to be reborn.
In the year following liberation, Rav Yaakov Avigdor re-established his role as a leader of the Jewish people. September 10, 1945, Belgium. Rav Yaakov joined with several other Rabbonim to establish a rabbinic court to address this pressing issue.
We have all come to the conclusion, with one opinion, to found a single organization that would be involved in these questions. And there in the Bezdin should be discussed all these subjects. Agunos, and men whose wives were killed. With the help of God, we sign.
Meanwhile, Reb Yitzchak had made his way to Milan, Italy. One day, he met a woman from his hometown of Drobich who was desperately searching for her husband. Reb Yitzchak had witnessed the man's death in Mauthausen and had the unenviable task of informing the woman that she was a widow.
Here is a signed letter attesting that your husband is no longer alive. Someday you may need this.
I do not need your letter.
I insist. This is for your own good. You must take it.
I am here because I wish to remarry.
Your situation needs to be investigated to confirm your status.
I have testimony that my husband was murdered by the Nazis, signed and witnessed right here.
Where did you get this letter?
A rabbi gave this to me in Milan.
You saw my son? He's alive?
3 months later, father and son arranged to meet. It was a crowded train station, and neither looked quite the same as he had the last time they had been together. After wandering the crowded platform, searching eyes and faces, exhausted, both men took to their seats and wound up sitting right next to each other, not recognizing one another. Time passed. Finally, out of sheer nervous impatience, Rabbi Yitzchak turned to his seatmate and opened conversation.
Do you know when the next train will be arriving?
Yitzchak!
Recognizing the sound of each other's voices, father and son embraced in a hug that closed a gap spanning years of pain and suffering. Their reuniting brought back healing and hope, and reminds Jews the world over that the questions we ask, the choices we make, the commitments we honor, the leadership we provide, and the history we cherish will keep the Torah legacy alive forever.
Our martyrs died with a prayer, not to be forgotten. Let us be worthy of their memory.
Mama.